How many people have been killed or injured by the COVID vaccines? Does anyone know the answer?
My second dose, I got a horrific pain in my right eye.
Why should you penalize people for not taking a vaccine which doesn't work?
The mRNA COVID vaccines need to be withdrawn from the market now. No one should get them. No one should get boosted. No one should get double boosted.
And I had to start blocking people that I've been friends with for years.
The Kaiser Family Foundation found that 64% of unvaccinated people believed at least 4 or more pieces of COVID misinformation of the 8 that they tested. And they found that among those who trusted conservative news outlets, belief in misinformation was more common than among those who trusted other sources. So I went back and searched for the earliest polling I could find. This is from May of 2020, and it asked people if they would get a hypothetical coronavirus vaccine. 40% of Republicans said definitely not or probably not. And that's pretty much where Republicans are at today, 20 months later. So what explains why a big chunk of Republican voters had already turned against the vaccine 6 months before the presidential election and nearly a whole year before the vaccines were even available? I think the answer is somewhere in here. Of the 8 false claims polled by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the one most widely believed wasn't about vaccines at all.
And so of the different pieces of misinformation we tested, the most commonly believed overall and particularly by Republicans was this idea that the government was inflating the number of deaths due to COVID-19.
Top U.S. health officials are rejecting President Trump's suggestion that the U.S. coronavirus case and death totals are fake news.
He said a couple of hours ago the number of cases and deaths of the China virus
are, quote, far exaggerated.
That claim was based on a misunderstanding of how death certificates work, but it was extremely potent. If we compare unvaccinated Republicans with their vaccinated counterparts, the biggest difference between them isn't that the unvaccinated ones are younger or more conservative or more rural, although they are. It's the pervasiveness of the belief that the seriousness of the coronavirus is generally exaggerated. And that idea that the pandemic has been made into a bigger deal than it really is has been an overarching belief for a majority of Republicans, even as COVID became one of the leading causes of death in the US, even as the virus shifted from cities to rural America. And that takes us back to the very first weeks of the pandemic, when the virus found a United States under an exceptionally polarizing president, and at the start of an election year.
We have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
Joe Biden calling him the worst possible person to lead our country through the virus.
Well, we pretty much shut it down coming in from China.
And President Trump has no plan, no urgency, no understanding of the facts.
If the coronavirus ends up having a real impact on the economy, it could tip the election to the Democrats.
Democrats and their media cronies have decided to weaponize fear to improve their chances against Trump in November.
In the early stages of the pandemic, you got this very large polarization around things like lockdowns, mask wearing, and the severity of the pandemic itself, just how seriously to take this.
Trump supported anti-lockdown protests.
Liberate Minnesota, Michigan, and Virginia.
States led by Democratic governors.
President Trump without a mask.
Defiance in the face of adversity.
Joe Biden wearing one.
An image of trepidation, even fear.
Making for a split-screen campaign moment.
And it seems that the rank-and-file Republicans, largely on their own, figured out that if you don't take the pandemic seriously, why would you get vaccinated? You know, like the people telling you to do it, they're not trustworthy. And so, you know, flash forward to spring of 2021, and you get this weird paradox where most Republican politicians are vaccinated, but they're saying stuff at the same time to cater to anti-vaccine sentiment in their base. And now there's real political downside to promoting vaccination for a lot of these folks. If we aren't really, really effective and proactive on reducing that polarization, is that polarization around COVID vaccination persists and spreads to other vaccines like measles, mumps, rubella.
And sure enough, researchers at UC San Diego tracked vaccine attitudes from March to August in 2021. And they found that not only were the Republicans in their study more likely to turn against the COVID vaccine as the year went on, they also ended up with declining attitudes about vaccines in general, and lower intentions to get the flu shot next year. Which means that the health consequences of pandemic polarization could extend well beyond COVID-19. Altogether, more than 900,000 people have died. We see that the deaths of unvaccinated people were much higher than vaccinated people. While the Delta wave did kill some vaccinated people, the risk was 15 times higher if you were unvaccinated. Now, when it comes to the political breakdown on vaccinations, there are two things to know. One is that a majority of Republicans are vaccinated with at least one dose. The second thing to know is that most unvaccinated Americans are Republican. It's not obvious that Republicans would be more vaccine hesitant. Similar percentages of Democrats and Republicans said that they get the flu shot every year, according to a May 2020 poll. And in 2019, the Pew Research Center found that nearly identical shares of Republicans and Democrats said that the benefits of vaccinating kids from measles, mumps, and rubella outweigh the risks. Republicans were slightly less likely to say they should be required, but it's nothing like the 30-point gap that we see in COVID vaccination rates today. One way to understand that gap is to consider the vastly different information environments that Republicans and Democrats live in. This is a list of news sources trusted by at least 40% of Democrats, according to a 2019 survey by Pew.
Health officials worried.
Highest daily rate
The COVID variant was first
latest
reported.
data from the Centers.
And here's a list of news sources trusted by at least 40% of Republicans.
What this means is that dangerous propaganda is coming from conservative networks like Fox, Sinclair Broadcast, Newsmax, and OAN, disguised as news and immorally fake. And the corporations that advertise in those networks are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. This is what happens when they elect a Trump who, without any reservation, consistently lies and is believed by millions of people who follow him blindly like a cult and refuse to even glimpse at other media news sources that could enlighten them. And when those conservative news networks influence people's vote, it could lead to the end of democracy in America. Fox News gets about 65% of its revenue from cable providers like Comcast and AT&T and Cox and Verizon. So every cable subscriber pays Fox News about $20 per year whether they watch the channel or not.